Good afternoon. This is Jim Lammers, president of Trinity3D.com, and I'm a certified V-Ray trainer. Today I'm going to present some new features of V-Ray Next for 3ds Max to follow up the Chaos webinar from a month ago. The prior webinar is on YouTube if you wish to see it. The main focus of this webinar is to answer your specific questions about V-Ray Next and demonstrate those answers in 3ds Max. That is the second half of today's webinar. So please send your questions now if you have them ready. As you saw in the June webinar, V-Ray Next is smarter, faster, and more powerful. Those features were broken out like this. There are a lot of great features here, but I think the main thrust of this product is really its powerful new GPU renderer. This renderer comes with every V-Ray license, so you now are getting two full production renderers in one package, V-Ray Next and V-Ray Next GPU. Almost all of the features of Next are for the GPU or are supported for GPU rendering, so I've put stars on the ones that are supported here. So in this first segment of the webinar today, I'm going to show you a little more about V-Ray GPU and also the Nvidia AI Denoiser, the switch material, opening scenes and other features in the V-Ray frame buffer, using VRscans with GPU rendering, and also a little bit more on GPU with IPR rendering when you've got different forms of lighting like HDR lighting. At any point during this webinar, you can type your questions into the GoToWebinar questions box. We will select questions from those that you are sending in. A quick comparison here between CPU and GPU versions of V-Ray Next. So historically we called the GPU version V-Ray RT. The first version of RT was really intended as a fast previewer, but it quickly evolved into more of a production-capable renderer. Now, it is a full-featured production rendering option right alongside the CPU renderer. They work very similarly. They both have an interactive mode, also called IPR, and a final production render mode. Comparing them here, you can see the main difference is the computational mode. So, for CPU rendering, the interactive rendering will rerun the GI for each change. It's a little delay while it pre-calculates light cache and possibly a radiance map before it kicks into the brute force IPR render. With V-Ray GPU, there is no pre-calculation. It is always purely brute force. For final rendering with GPU, it's almost always the light cache followed by a progressive render of the frame with brute force rendering. For render setup, you no longer use active shade or iterative modes. You simply set production renderer to V-Ray Next or V-Ray GPU Next. Then you hit the IPR or render button for an interactive render or a final render, respectively. So why would you choose to render with GPU? Well, the main thing is it's usually faster and it's usually cheaper. The software is much faster running on video cards for most scenes. For the hardware, you can have a single workstation, and I've seen as many as 11 rendering cards in it. And that means fewer machines, fewer render node licenses. The fewer machines don't need really much in the way of RAM or high-powered CPUs. They make less heat, and they use less power. And when you need to upgrade, you just change out the video card. And to make your transition from CPU to GPU possible, they have compiled the GPU renderer to work on CPUs. That means you can still use your farm, and machines with great CPUs will crunch it out in the emulation mode. And this also has the benefit of being able to use all the system RAM, because video cards are still somewhat limited. Why would you not want to use GPU? There are still some reasons that are pretty strong. With really huge scene files, they just won't fit on the video card's memory. Typical GTX cards of today, they cost $700 or so, and they typically have 11 gigs of RAM. I'm sure that'll get bigger soon, and the pro level cards can actually be ganged together, so you can gang two 32 gig cards and have 64 gigs of RAM. But these cards are multi-$1,000 video cards. Another possible reason is if you ever need to output to a really large image size, like say 20,000 by 20,000 pixels, you can still do that with V-Ray through bucket rendering and saving to VRIMG. It's not going to work with GPU rendering. There's some unsupported features, but the main one would probably be dispersion, which is the rainbow effect you can get with jewelry. So jewelry renders, the crypto matte render element is important to some people. It requires bucket rendering. And then there are some specialty materials and maps and some render elements that are not supported. You'll just have to look at the online list and see if it's an issue. But for most common types of animation work that aren't related to jewelry, it's quite possible that the majority of your work could move to the GPU renderer. Now let's go use V-Ray Next. Remember that as a registrant of this seminar, you will all get a 30-day full license of V-Ray Next, as well as the fluid dynamic simulation system called Phoenix FD, and also VRscans, which I will be demonstrating in a few minutes. You will be contacted after this webinar to set up your free 30-day license. Okay, be sure to also send us your questions now for us to answer during the question and answer session, which we will start in about 15 minutes. For this scene, I'd like to show you a little bit more about CPU versus GPU, and also how the denoiser works, the one that comes from Nvidia, and also a little bit about the controls. So you'll notice in here we have production rendering mode, iterative rendering mode. We switch between those, nothing changes. They're equivalent to each other. If we go to active shade mode, there is no V-Ray. So you never really use these switches anymore because you can stay in production rendering mode all the time with V-Ray Next. For your interactive rendering, you would simply go to the Start IPR button, and for the full render, the upper right button. Both of these are mirrored in the frame buffer. This is the iterative renderer, and this is the final render. So these are equivalent to the Start IPR and the render button up here. So the scene I've got here is currently set with V-Ray Next, and we'll go ahead and start an IPR render of it. And so this is going to be a CPU only render. We see it calculates the light cache first, and then it begins crunching the image. If we go and modify the camera, for example, it has to re-render the light cache. And then it starts crunching out the final again. One of the really neat integrated features with V-Ray Next is a denoiser that uses the video card. So if we want to add that, we go to Render Elements, and we click Add, and we add the V-Ray denoiser. We have to switch that over to the Nvidia mode here. So this will calculate and give us a look at what it's doing pretty much with almost every pass. You can control how often it looks for the denoised result with the post effects rate. This number here can be raised to a higher level. Right now it's at 10% of computation for post effects. So now if we render, I'm going to re-begin the iterative mode. Take a look up here where it says RGB color, and you'll see that it switches within a few passes to the smooth result. Right there, it went to effects result. Now you can always go back and see the unsmooth version. You can also choose the select buckets mode, and it'll follow the mouse and it'll smooth in the areas where your mouse is. So perhaps you can see it better if I hold my mouse in around here. And of course, as it denoises, that quality will get better as well. So let's stop that, and we'll go ahead and do a full production render with V-Ray Next. And here it's calculating the light cache. And again, you'll see once it gets to the full rendering, within 3 or 4 passes, RGB colors will switch to effect result. Next, I'm going to switch the renderer from V-Ray Next to V-Ray GPU Next. It's recommended that you build your scenes for one renderer or the other. Conversion is not supposed to be direct. A lot of things look different. Materials sometimes give different results. Color curves and other things will look different. So the conversion here will illustrate that. You can see this one now has jumped to the effects result. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this. I'll go ahead and switch my renderer now over to V-Ray GPU next. I'm going to go to Performance, and I'm going to set this to low GPU thread priority since I'm recording a movie. If I roll out my render devices, you can see I'm using both my CPU and my GPU. So they work together, and this one is a fast enough CPU that it can usually add about 30% to the render speed from GPU alone. So it's actually running in parallel on these two and combining the results. I'm on a dual 14 Xeon system. I like to monitor my video card consumption, and I have a little utility here I'll show you. It's called Tech Power Up GPU Z. It's a freebie, and it lets you see your GPU load and also how much memory is being used on your video card. So that can be handy for keeping an eye on things while it's rendering. Okay, so our denoiser is still active. Let's go back and let's begin a start IPR session. And we should see the video card memory go up, and then when it begins rendering with the video card, we should see the GPU load go up as well. So it's quite a bit darker looking. I'm going to turn on my history here, and we can see the earlier tests and how this one is somewhat darker. Also, some of the materials are rendering somewhat differently. But this is a real-time render, and if I adjust my camera again, you'll see it, well, we're seeing the smooth result, so it seems almost instantaneous. Let's go back to RGB color, and we'll move again, and we'll zoom it in a little bit. And it jumped to the effects result again. But it's pretty amazing how quickly you get what looks like a finished render when you have GPU and, of course, CPU assist and the Nvidia Denoiser. I'll stop this and we'll go ahead and render out a final. Same thing where it's going to, this one is set to pre-calculate a light cache first, and then it'll do the final rendering. So there's our light cache. And you'll see RGB color switch to the effect result, usually by the third pass. So very quickly to a beautiful result. And here we are. There's the underlying noise it's smoothing out. Next up, let's take a look at the V-Ray switch material. Anyone who creates product renderings or architecture where they're trying various styles will really appreciate this new feature. It lets you simply adjust a material from one to another with a variable. So I'm going to take this upper left swatch, and we'll put the V-Ray switch material in there. And once that material's in there, you have 10 materials, and as this switch goes, you'll see it's not an integer, it actually goes up as a number. And you can use a map to adjust, or you can simply animate this number scrolling. But as it goes from 0.49 to 0.5, it sort of adjusts from material 0 to material 1. Let's go ahead and just sort of see how that looks. I've got 3 ceramic materials here. I'll just plop them down into material 0, material 1, and material 2. So you can see right away as we scroll this number up, when we get past the 0.5 and then all the way up through to 1.5, it stays on the second material. It also has the options for 2 and above. If you use a map, it just uses black and white, so shades of gray here. If we just put, like, say, a noise map on there, you'll see at the threshold point, it just breaks from material 0 to 1. I think the more likely way that you might use this would be to auto key, and then you could just choose different points in time. So this could be 0 here at frame 1, it could be material 2. There we go. and then at frame 2 we come down to white again, and you can see how easily the materials can change. And these could be radically different materials, of course. One could be chrome and one could be some kind of complex grainy car paint or something. Next, I'd like to show you one of the new features with V-Ray's frame buffer. So if we bring up the render settings, we can get to the frame buffer whether it's showing or not. Now it's blank, but if I bring up my history, the history is all saved there. The history gets saved as individual files wherever you've told it to save those, and they look like this. You'll notice the file sizes are large, but they're not so large that they actually contain the scene. They contain a lot of the settings for V-Ray, color corrections, and other attributes, as well as all of the channels of the image. For example, if I load an image up, then it's got the additional channels that were saved with that image. You can also right-click and you can load the V-Ray settings that were used to render that scene, or even compare them from shot to shot. I'm going to open this scene that was rendered using VRscans. So now it's loaded, and we'll take a look at how this renders with V-Ray GPU. This is a new feature where VRscans will render perfectly. We can just switch this. Again, we talked about how this is not always going to give you a conversion that you like, but I'm just going to change my render to GPU. The only change I'm going to make is under performance. I'll lower my GPU threshold priority. We'll use both the computer and the video card, which is a GTX 1080, to render this. So here we go. And it's now rendering the GPU version with VRscans. And you'll see that the VRscan materials really do look pretty much identical. So I'll bring up my history here, and you can see the prior rendering here, which I can do an A/B comparison with. This one has a little depth of field, which is kind of nice to see. It's a really rich rendering. And I'll go ahead and stop that at this point. And we'll compare those two shots. So I'll set this one as B, and I'll set this one as A. And you'll see that the VRscans are quite similar. The main difference we see is in the other V-Ray materials, like the chrome in particular. All right, so I'll disable the A/B, and we'll go ahead and try to apply a VRscan. If you subscribe to VRscans, you'll get this library of about 700 materials that have already been scanned. And these are really large files that contain every attribute of the material, their glossiness and their softness, and just every way they reflect and absorb light is embedded in these. When you're in the library, you can search for specific types of scans as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and bring up the material editor, and we'll just eyedropper a material from the scene. And so we know that this one is this leather beige VRscan. What if we change that to a different kind of material? So here's one I have that's a gray cloth with perf. You can see the size of it over here. It's 300 megabytes. When I load it in, you can see it's only an 11 by 9 centimeter swatch. It's not a very large swatch. Sometimes these materials have completely different mapping, so in order to fix that, I'm just going to enable the use triplanar mapping. And this should give us a pretty good result now when I go and re-render one more time. So now we're going to have perf cloth in place of the leather here. It's kind of silly, but it'll be an interesting experiment. Okay, this last scene is just to show a little bit more about the GPU and the way it works for IPRs. After this, we'll get to the Q&A, which I'm looking forward to. A quick look at this then. If we bring up the render setup, this is a GPU next render. And if we try to do an IPR on this, you'll notice we have a dome light, which there's no lights within the room. All the light comes from a little window in the wall. And because the GPU IPR doesn't run a light cache first, it can't take advantage of the light cache techniques that let it do the optimized dome light, the adaptive dome. There are other features too, like the camera color, auto color, and auto exposure that require the light cache to look at that. So this render, when I start an IPR, it's just going to look really bad for a long time. You'll see it switch to effects result right away, but there's just not enough. It takes it too long for it to find where all the pixels down in the lower left corner should be getting their light from. If I get back to RGB, you'll see how noisy it is. So this is the sort of render that you're much better served just going ahead and doing just a full render, because you get that light cache before it takes off. So here's our light cache. Now we have a much better result right away. It's already switched over to our effects result. There's some artifacting in the lower area, but this will get cleaner as it runs. So right now we're rendering with both CPU and GPU. You can hear my machine's fans crank up as everything works as hard as it can. Here's the same thing if we try it again with no dome light and just a simple sunlight. We have the same kind of problem. So an IPR rendering here is going to be, we just have a simple hot sunlight on the floor here lighting up the room, but still it just can't get to that through brute force very quickly. So I'm on the line with Veso from Chaos Group, and he's going to help us answer some of the questions that you've sent. Are you there?
Yes, I am, Jim. Can you hear me?
Great, thanks for joining us today. Yeah, all the way from Sofia, Bulgaria.
That's right.
So we got a lot of interesting questions to talk over a little bit. I'll address a couple of these in the short run, and then I'll pass it over to Veso. So let's see, one of the questions that came to me, someone asked about the denoising and the GPU render options for render elements. So when we go to render elements, there is a denoise checkbox here for any of the individual elements. So they can be individually enabled for each of the different kinds of render elements. Another question that came in related to displacement with VRscans. And on this one, I noticed that VRscans often have a height map included in the texture. And there is an option for displace edges for the material, but it's not like a map that's applied, and you cannot, I don't think you can replace the mapping except for filter and paint color are the only options with VRscans. So it's a little different than a normal bitmap. Another question that came in related to Nvidia cards, and Veso, you might be able to help me on this. They asked if special Nvidia cards are required to do the special denoiser, the AI denoiser. As far as I know, any of the modern Quadro or GeForce or GTX type cards should be able to handle that algorithm. Do you know?
Yes, I think definitely pretty much every graphics card can run that algorithm, and it's going to work just fine, as far as I know.
That sounds good. What about the benchmark? Someone asked here, I have it loaded up.
The benchmark, yes. Well, I know that the guys here are working currently on it. I don't have a date or, like a specific time that this thing is going to be completed, but people are working on it, and it's going to happen soon.
That's good to know. Yeah, I see the date on this is prior to when Next came out. So
right.
Let's see. The denoiser had an option for denoising RGB or denoise per element. This was Eric that asked that, and it's always the CPU denoiser when you are denoising render elements. Is that correct? Or are you, I suppose it's just a checkbox down there. So
yeah, it is a checkbox right at the bottom of each render element. You get like a denoiser, like the noise per render element checkbox. Yeah, this one.
Is it going to use the denoiser that's selected in the denoiser render element if we change this to the Nvidia?
Well, that's the thing about it. The Nvidia denoiser does not have this option. Only the V-Ray denoiser has it. So if you want to denoise per render element, then you have to use the V-Ray denoiser to do that.
Good to know. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I have did you have another segment you wanted to talk about, Veso, or?
Oh, yeah. There is a question here about the auto exposure that I can address.
Oh,
the question is that if we can use the auto exposure setting in perspective view, or does it need to be in, you know, like in using a camera? Either it's going to be the physical camera of 3ds Max or the V-Ray physical camera.
Oh, Veso, you can share your screen when you're ready.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Go ahead.
So I think the answer is yes, you can use it using the perspective. So if, like, for instance, right here, I have my render camera, which I think it's, let's see, it's a 3ds Max physical camera in this case. But if we switch to perspective, for example, you can, yeah. And we'd like to render this using the auto exposure setting. Is it going to work? Well, probably not at first. So let's give it a shot. Let's see. So if we go to camera and then just switch that thing on and just render. Okay, so it seems like it's working, but if you, and that's because I had a camera before. So if in theory, if you start a new scene and you have it on perspective and you start rendering, it's not going to work, the auto exposure setting, because in order for it to work, it needs either an exposure value, an EV value, or an ISO to, you know, adjust. So I already had a camera before, and I bet here if I go to my exposure control right here, yeah, it's already switched to the physical camera exposure control. So you either have to use this one or V-Ray exposure control, for example, one of those two. So you get this camera settings, which the auto exposure is going to tweak in order to get the right exposure. So if I just switch it off and then render it, probably it's going to lose it. All right, maybe it still remembers it somehow. But yeah, that's what you need in order to use the perspective mode and renders using the auto exposure and auto white balance. You need to have some sort of exposure control, and it's going to work. You also have to have the light cache enabled. So if you use it on the GPU in IPR mode, it's not going to work. So you need a light cache pass in order for this auto exposure and auto white balance to work. All right, so I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, very helpful. I was going to point out that it does derive those values from light cache. So if you went straight to IPR, it's not going to have a light cache when you're rendering with V-Ray GPU. So great point there.
Right. But also, just to add to this, one way to fix this very easily is just render it in production mode just one time, and then you can transfer to camera, use this button, and then it's going to transfer all the settings to the camera, and then you can use it in IPR, and it's going to be the right exposure.
I'm sorry, I switched it back to my screen, but the settings he's referring to are under V-Ray, settings, camera, and once the values are in here, it's this button right here that transfers it to the camera. So
that's right.
Excellent. Hey, I had a question from someone about flicker-free animation with V-Ray GPU rendering. So I haven't in practice done this yet. This was Marvin that asked this question, but I think it's a good question. The rendering, of course, is just purely light cache and brute force. So my expectations are that you would go in and pre-calc that light cache as a fly-through for the sequence of frames in the camera that you are going to make an animation from. And usually when you're doing this sort of work, let's see, I don't see an option for, let me switch this to expert mode. Yeah, I think usually you have to go to world units if you want to get a good result from this kind of thing. So you have to arrive at a fixed world sized fly through, and then this will automatically save to a file that it switches to then. And then that light cache is what's used. Then brute force rendering, I think you would have to just work with a noise limit and sample limit. Vesa, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, just I think if you just switch to the light cache to fly through, it should give you a pretty good result. Or if you just render it in brute force, definitely it's going to be flicker free. It will take longer time though to do it in animation.
If it needs moving, you'd have to use your GI would have to be brute force, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it's a good idea.
Good point. Let's see, is there any benefit to outfitting render nodes on a farm with a 1080 GTX or Titan card? Asks David. Can a distributed rendering backburner set up for a single frame render take advantage of this?
Well,
you distributed rendering through with GPU Next.
Yeah, there is distributed rendering with GPU Next, of course.
Maybe I'll pass it over to you so you can present. Go ahead.
Okay. So the distributed rendering is under the performance tab. When you switch to the GPU, and then the performance tab has it right here. And if you enable it, you can just set up all the render servers and everything just as before.
If you're doing this with Backburner, you would have one machine acting as a master, and then all of the DR slaves would just act as they would just be spawners.
Right.
So,
but yeah, I haven't really tried it with the Backburner before. Usually the way I do it is just I render, set up all the render servers here, and I just render it. So the master machine is like the one that I'm sitting on, and then I set up, 10 or 15, 20 machines, and I just do it through here. I haven't done it through the Backburner before, so I don't know. Maybe, Jim, if you know, if you can give more information about that, that would be great.
Yeah, it's possible to send a Backburner job just to a single machine, and if the Backburner job has the distributed rendering enabled within it, and those machines are available, then that one machine will render as the master computer, and the DR spawners will pick up and contribute to that frame. So I think that the focus here that David was asking about is probably for rendering really large stills and getting them done fast. And he's right that you would need to put some good video cards on those different machines. That or enable the CPU rendering because the CPU emulator, in my experience, I'm running, as you probably saw in my earlier presentation, on this Dual 14, I still found the GTX could outperform it by double for a typical render with a lot of, like an interior render with a lot of reflected light. So hugely faster with the video card.
Usually video cards are sort of designed to be faster than CPUs, but in some situations, it's not the preferred, hardware to use. So it's different. Like for some people, and also it depends what you have chosen from the beginning to use. It's going to be CPU or GPU. So that's why we have those two engines as just a separate thing, and you'll never be able to, like make an image on the CPU and then switch to the GPU and get the exact same result. It's because there are two different engines.
Yeah, I experienced that too. I saw differences, and I know that's not the expectation. They say you should start from the beginning with the renderer you're going to use.
Yeah, definitely.
Justin asks, using a single GTX 1080 and only rendering at 2000 by 2000 pixels, what would I be better served by, CPU or GPU rendering? And I think the answer is if the shot is like an interior shot where there's a lot of reflected light, there's a good chance the GPU will far outperform the CPU. That's been my experience.
Yeah, I would agree with that. But it depends. Like, for instance, you have a very good CPU. So, it's debatable. Sometimes, if you have a great CPU, they might come very close.
Yeah. I know that different scenes respond different ways to that. The things that always get really difficult is where you have a lot of indirect light. You've got, a lot of bright stuff outside and then lights coming in from lots of angles through openings. And maybe you've got 100 different small lights. We see this a lot here at my company. We do some production animation, and we find that, like with jet interiors, we do a lot of interiors of jets, and there's just 1,000 light sources and a lot of reflected light. And this seems to be one case where the CPU really, the power, whatever power you're throwing at it, it uses all of it. They can take a half hour for a frame. So GPU seems to really excel at this kind of complex indirect light computation.
Also, the new adaptive light thing is going to happen. It's going to help a lot in this sort of situations when you have to deal with indirect lighting, and that is going to be just a interior or an airplane or something. You have small openings for the light to pass through, and then in the past, we used sky portals just so we can get like faster results, but with the new adaptive dome, it's going to be faster naturally, and actually the result that you're going to get is going to be more accurate than before. Also, I think there was a question somewhere back about the sky portals and all that. Hopefully using the adaptive dome light is going to like help these guys out.
It's amazing how the light cache speeds that up so much to find those openings. We did have someone who asked directly about, he says, this is Justin, in our workplace, we're on the fence about using skylight portals because we often just use normal V-Ray plane lights. So in a shot like this one I'm displaying here, they would just put a big V-Ray plane light where the window should be. He says, it's worked fine, but of course that's just going to create white light that just floods in from all directions. Did you have something to add, Veso? Go ahead.
No, what I was about to say is that, prior, like at version 3.6 and before that, you had to put a skylight where the door is, just so this way, V-Ray would actually sample more in the right spots. But right now, if they use the adaptive dome lights, they don't have to do that anymore. They don't even have to use those skylights. They can delete them. And just using a normal plane light instead if you put it over there, that's not a good idea, because this way you can't really use image-based lighting and HDRs and stuff. Yeah, you're gonna create your artificial light, but then I don't think it's gonna create a very realistic result. And of course that depends, I mean, of the setup. So it's not the same thing every time.
I'm setting you to be the presenter. Robert asks, with a stereoscopic 360 render helper, I could never figure out how to make it render more than one image at a time. Have you, do you know what he's referring to with the stereo rendering?
Well, no, but I haven't really used that much, but I can, of course, ask around and then maybe get back to the guy.
Okay.
Follow up. Yeah. Because I haven't really used the stereoscopic much and all the 360 and VR stuff. So I'm not exactly sure. But I would definitely love to find the answer out and, answer the guy.
Another, Lawrence asks, how does V-Ray handle loading and rendering point clouds in VR mesh format? Is that more CPU or GPU intensive? Our point clouds can be hundreds of millions of points. No doubt they're doing some kind of laser or LiDAR scanning and bringing in really large point clouds. There is a option for loading a point cloud in Max where you can see it and you can set the pixel size for each point. It seems to me that it's going to be pretty RAM intensive once that goes to render. That's been my experience when it's hundreds of millions of points. Have you any experience with this, Veso?
Not much, but I would definitely agree that it takes up a lot of RAM.
It's probably not going to be too functional on GPU since most affordable video cards top out at 11 gigs. Yeah.
You'll probably have like 12 gigs, and you're probably gonna max it out pretty fast.
Yeah, I think that's likely to be the answer on that one. Okay, we got time for a couple more questions, and let's see if there's anything.
Oh, there is a question here about the new denoiser. Maybe I can check.
Yes.
Is it can we use the Nvidia Denoiser, the AI Denoiser for in production rendering? And in theory, yes, you can, of course, but actually, it's not. In my opinion, it's not such a good idea because the Nvidia Denoiser produces different result every time. So if you have to re-render something, it's going to be different. It's not going to match up exactly. And also, you cannot denoise per render element, so you cannot really use it in compositing or anything like that. And just because it produces different results every time, it's not also suitable for animation. And it doesn't have frame blending, for example, so you're gonna have a lot of flickering and stuff like that. So
it's really more of a preview tool that gets you
definitely, but on the pro side, it's a great preview tool, and if you're in your look development phase, this is a great tool because it's very fast. It gives you results right away and very interactive, and also it handles refraction very well and very accurately. So great preview tool, but in production, probably you'll be better off using the standard V-Ray denoiser. It's going to give you way better results, in my opinion.
Okay. I had a question about the lighting analysis tool. It says, I believe the way to use the exposure meter has changed. Could you explain a bit more about the right way to calculate now? So I was, I'll go ahead and switch presenter to myself. And I loaded a scene here where we've got the exposure option in there. It's V-Ray lighting analysis. And I think I better stop the rendering. This one requires bucket rendering, so this one does require CPU rendering. And there's a place in here where you can choose the the controls for it. I believe he's referring to you can choose between candelas and lux for the quantity.
That's right. Yeah, that's sort of your measurement units.
And then you can go with a logarithmic scale if you need to. If you're going to have very dim and very bright areas, this logarithmic scale might allow you to detect numbers in those lower intensity places more easily. And then you can overlay the markers with the grid horizontal and vertical spacing. I'm not sure that there's much beyond it from that, but I know this comes up with lighting engineers when they're working on architectural projects. They have to prove that they're lighting things smoothly and fully.
Oh, and yeah, that's pretty much the main reason. And I think also they do this in reality just so they'll know what sort of actual light bulbs and what sort of lighting they need. Because this way, if you actually mimic the with the right illuminance, the lux and everything, like if you get all the light bulbs and you measure them in the right units, you get a very accurate reading. And in reality, when they build the whole building, and if you go to the store and buy the same light bulbs, you're gonna get the exact same lighting setup in the real building.
Yeah, that's important for the engineering side. And we have another question with respect to GPU with Phoenix FD, and I have seen that it is fully supported, and not only Phoenix, but even like RealFlow and RealWave, they use a common file format for the fluid simulation, and all of those formats are supported, where you can bring those into Max and then render with V-Ray GPU. Should see a big increase in speed.
Yeah, definitely. As V-Ray Next has a full support for all volumetrics, so even if you have volumetrics from Phoenix or from Houdini or whatever, you can just load them in a volume grid, and V-Ray GPU is gonna render them. Also, and yeah, it renders them much faster than the CPU, which is great. Also, that allows for rendering environment fog as well, which was not supported on the GPU up until now. So that's great.
So I went ahead and set a lower resolution so this could finish off, and I could show the false color for the lighting simulation.
Yeah, you need to wait for the whole thing to finish off until you can calculate the lighting analysis. Yes, that's exactly how it works.
Can't recall if it updates this. Yeah, right here. There we go. So you can update it in real time once the calculation is complete.
That's right.
Kind of nice. Did you have any other questions you wanted to respond to, Veso? I think we're about at the end of our time.
All right, that's great.
Thank you all for attending. We will make this movie available on our YouTube channel, and we will also send all of you a link where you can get your full 30-day license, not only for V-Ray Next, but also for Phoenix and VRscans. Thanks for attending. And thank you, Veso, for participating.
Thank you, guys.